Good morning. This is Invest in Women and Change the World. I'm Denise Rastari, Forbes.com contributor, and I amplify the voices of girls and women. Today we have an incredible panel because, as you can see, we have three incredible women on the panel. Each has their own approach, their own fixes to the challenges that are facing girls and young women today. So let me introduce them. Although you know them, Melinda French Gates, co-chair and trustee of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Jacqueline Novogratz, CEO of the Acumen Fund. And Dion von Furstenberg, CEO of DVF. Thank you all. It's a huge honor to have you with us. Last week, I wrote about a 19-year-old girl, Shannon McNamara. Shannon is investing in girls in Africa through education. And Shannon says she can do that because she won the birth lottery, or as Warren Buffett calls it, the ovarian lottery, being born at the right place, the right time, with the right amount of brains. But Shannon says that she won the birth lottery because she was born in America, as opposed to a developing country where just being a girl, her life would have been dramatically different. So what happens if you're a woman who doesn't win the birth lottery? Well, here are three stunning facts, hard facts. One, more than 200 million women in developing countries who do not want to get pregnant lack access to contraceptives, information, and services. Two, women are the primary water collectors in 2/3 of households in the developing world. They often have to walk up to 6 kilometers just to get that water. And then when they get to the water, it's unsafe for drinking, which leads to this fact that 3.5 million people die of waterborne illnesses each year. It's mind-boggling on so many levels. And then women perform 66% of the world's work. They produce 50% of the food, yet they only earn 10% of the income and own 1% of the property. But there's good news. When we invest in women, the world does change. And here's why, just one example. Women dedicate 90% of their income to their families, to health, education, and the communities, as compared to men who only dedicate 30 to 40% of their income. So we know that investing in women and girls is so much bigger than just the right thing to do, that it has massive implications, political, social, economic. And that's what we're going to talk about today. The investing in women and girls, what does that mean? How are we investing in women and girls? What's success look like? What are the challenges? What you won't hear are a bunch of planned answers because we have a courageous panel who has all agreed to not have questions in advance. They're going to have conversations amongst themselves for you to share in, and then we will wrap up with a 10-minute Q&A. So that you know the session right now is on the record, the Q&A is off the record. So ladies, let's get started. Everyone loves a personal story. So if you will, tell a story about investing in women and girls, what that means to you, with a story that starts with, I saw, I heard, I am, I learned. Melinda, would you lead this conversation?
Sure. You know, for me, it's hard to boil it down to just one story, and I think you'll probably hear that from all of us today. For me, it really has a lot to do with traveling over the last 10 years to places like Bangladesh and India and a whole host of African countries. But I'll tell one story that kind of sums up what I've heard over those 10 years, which has surprised me. I would go out in these remote villages, let's say in India, to talk to women, and you'd sit down and you'd often sit across from a mat on one side of the mat and them on the other. And you'd start to talk about their children and what they want for their children and their dreams for their children, and can they fulfill those dreams. And you talked about basic health needs, water, etc., food. And I would do the same thing in Africa. And what always struck me was how similar they were to the people I know in the United States, my friends, myself, that what you dream of for your child is to get them on that trajectory that Oprah talks about, getting them, well-fed and an education that they can get on this trajectory of life to be the person they want to be. And what I would hear from women over and over again, particularly after I would have a longer conversation with them, is, I can't even decide in my family. I don't have the power to space my children. I know there are tools there. They used to give them in the health clinic. I used to be able to get a shot 5 months ago. I just went. I can't get another one. I can't even decide to have one child now and 4 years from now have another, so I have a chance of feeding this one and then educating the other one. And the thing that just struck me was how much these women knew about contraception, things that we talk about in the United States. We talk to our daughters about it, we use them ourselves. And they would say, what I want for my child, and one woman summed this up for me this year in a slum outside of Nairobi. It's a slum called Korogocho, which literally means, translated, standing shoulder to shoulder. So you can imagine what this slum is like. And she said, I want every good thing for my child before I have another one. And I thought, that's it. That's the universal truth of what we want to be able to have. And yet, as a mother, you can't give every good thing to your child unless you can plan for those births. And that's something that's just not happening around the world. And we can talk about why that is, but it's been off the global health agenda for the last over decade. And I think that's really a crime. So
We'll go to Deanne. Will you share your I am, I heard, I saw?
Well, I would like to go to the roots of what has driven me and what also repeats itself constantly. I would like to take everybody to 1944, month of June. A young girl is arrested in Belgium by the Germans, and she goes to the concentration camp of Auschwitz, where she works in the weapon factory at night. She stays there, and then there's the death march because the Germans are losing the war, and they walk to Ravensbrück and to another camp. And in June 1945, the Germans disappear and she's liberated. That girl, who is 20 years old, weighs 29 kilos, which is about 49 pounds. She's not supposed to be survived. She's barely the weight of her bones. And when she has to fill the little form, she writes her name, and because for repatriation, she writes her name, and it said state of your health. And she writes, even though she's 49 pounds, she can barely move, excellent health. Well, that girl was my mother, and she did survive. She went back home. A few months later, she got better. She got married, and the doctor said, no matter what you do, you cannot have a child for a few years because you won't make it, nor will the child. Well, here I am the child. So my mother taught me that fear was not an option. And my mother's also taught me that no matter how bad it was, she was never a victim. She was lucky to have survived. And therefore, for me, freedom is the most important thing. I personally found my freedom, my very simple freedom and independence through my work. And but now my motivation and my mission is to be able to give as many women as possible the possibility of freedom and and I have never met a woman who is not strong. All women are strong, but sometimes because of a husband, a brother, a religion, a condition, or even sometimes because of themselves, they will not allow that strength to come out. And then tragedy happens, and miraculously, the strength comes out. with this tragedy. So it's better to try to make it come out prior to the tragedy. That's how I got there, and that's my message. And about a month ago, my son sent me an email on a Sunday morning, and it was such a nice thing, and I don't remember who said it. Maybe it was Gandhi. He said, "The key to happiness is freedom. The key to freedom is courage."
It's a wonderful story. Thank you. And Jacqueline, your I am, I saw, I heard.
I left my career on Wall Street in 1986, and I moved to Rwanda to help start that country's first microfinance bank. And I saw that a small group of human beings, in this case women, really could change at least a pocket of the world, and in our case make history. At the time, 1986, women were only given the right for the first time in the country's history to open a bank account without their husband's signature. A few years later, I heard during the Rwandan genocide that the women with whom I had started this bank played out every conceivable role of the genocide, from being killed in the first hour to watching their families massacred to being major perpetrators. Our first executive director turned out to be the highest ranking Rwandan official charged and convicted with capital crimes of genocide. And what I learned through all of that is really connected to what you're saying, Diane, and also Oprah, that at the end of the day, dignity is more important to the spirit than wealth. And dignity comes from a place of freedom, from choice, from opportunity, and that if we are going to create a world in which everyone has dignity, we can't rely on the old ways of just leaving it to the market, nor of leading it to government, but that there has to be a way that starts by seeing low-income people as full human beings, building solutions from their perspective, and insisting on scale and sustainability. And that's really where my organization, Acumen Fund, came in 2001, built on so many of the learnings from that period.
Thank you. So we now know the compelling stories behind your stories. We can go now to the how. How are you investing in women and girls? And what does that look to each of you? And we'll start with Jacqueline, if you can start this one.
Sure. The premise of Acumen Fund is that there is this third way to solve problems of poverty. And why I start with poverty and not with women and girls is because when you're talking about poverty, you're talking about women and children. And so what we do is raise philanthropy, but we invest equity and loans in entrepreneurs who are focused on long-term social impact, not short-term financial gain. We realize that if you're trying to find ways to bring clean water to low-income people, or housing or healthcare or agricultural inputs, you have to fight not only corruption and no infrastructure, but the fact that most of these communities have such little levels of trust. And so it takes a long time. We used to think 5 to 7 years. It's more like 7 to 12 years. But that you can fully build companies using private resources that ultimately end up partnering with government. So we've invested about $75 million in 65 companies, and have seen those companies reach 90 million people in the last year and create 65,000 jobs. The overwhelming number of jobs have gone to women, not because the entrepreneurs were focused specifically on women, but because they think that they're the best people to employ. The services primarily are purchased by women, and the most important thing in some ways for me is we're learning so much about what it takes to get clean water or healthcare in a way that women can use and make good use of, but that's also sustainable.
And this is a conversation. Melinda and Deanne, just jump in as you like.
Well, I would just say, I mean, one of the things that Jacqueline's talking about, is you have to look at, I think you have to look at where women are represented in society and where do you need to invest very strategically to get an outcome. So for instance, one of the things that the Acumen Fund does, I think, incredibly well in agriculture, if you look in Africa, 70% of the farms are farmed by women. And yet to run a farm is a very complex task. Most of these are less than 2-hectare size farms. You have to have the right inputs, right? You have to have a seed that's going to grow in the soil that you've got. So if you're in a very drought-ridden area, you need the right seed, or you need a little bit of fertilizer. You need to have the right inputs. And yet most agri-dealers in Africa deal with men. And so they don't even get the inputs to the women. So you have to look at, how do you look at where women are in society and how do you give them the inputs? At the end of the day, it's about women lifting themselves up, as you said, and lifting their families up, because when they get that extra income, we know they plow it back into the family. And so I think one of the great things that Acumen does is they really are working on the ground to see, how do you invest in women in very strategic ways in all these different countries around the world?
And actually, it's really about leadership. I think that I am extremely involved with this organization called Vital Voices because it really speaks to me, and because it's not, you know, giving charity, but it's really helping women leaders and all around the country. And they have helped so far about 12,000 women leaders in 144 countries. And sometimes a leader, it doesn't have to be a big leader, it's a small community. And, but what is extraordinary about the leadership is these are all women who have had the courage to fight their own misery. And then after that, and they've had the power to survive, and then the leadership to help. And to inspire others. And every one of these women that I have met through Vital Voices just make me feel so small and humbled me so much, like, what have I done? You know, because these women, whether they started like they were sold at 5 years old in the brothel and grew up in the brothel and came out of it and now has schools and orphanages and everything. And then she goes to Europe, where she gets a big award. And then while she's in Europe, because they found out she gets money, they steal their children. I mean, it's like it's an ongoing thing. But the network and the strength of these women is so contagious, and it's so wonderful. And to be able to say that we are part of this, and that we weave this fabric of courage and strength, and all women are the same. It doesn't matter. I mean, last week I was at the board meeting, and there were all these women from Middle East now who are fighting in order to be able to sit and help writing all these constitutions in Libya and in Egypt. And it's unbelievable. I mean, it's unbelievable the amount of difficulties and things that they have to. And so I think for me, the most important thing to fight for, because for me, if freedom is the most important, is really that, you know, to give women more leadership, so that, you know, to advance the human rights, to have more political participancy and economic development, because that's how it happens.
If I could just pick up on this leadership piece, I was saying to Melinda before that the Gates Foundation has been an incredible partner to us in agriculture and also in water. And one of the important lessons, I think, for this group is that this stuff is really hard and it takes a long time. And so I just think of one story of trying to figure out, what does it take? Everybody wants to get clean drinking water to the rural poor. We build lots of wells, we try all these different ways that, as Oprah said before, sometimes give us short-term gratification, but not necessarily give us the long-term solution. So we went in with Gates support, not just money, but real technical support as partners to build a company. And the first lesson we learned, that build it and they do not necessarily come. In fact, they usually don't, when you're bringing something that no one's ever paid for before, like clean drinking water. God gives it to us, God will decide if we get sick or not. And the second one was, we got the gender piece all wrong. We figured that since women are the water carriers, that women would be the ones that would buy the water, not when you're talking about a technology. And then third, how do you even create a market when people don't necessarily want to pay? And so had to bring in lots of different marketers, which isn't a word that's always comfortable in philanthropy, and find a way to essentially show the women that the water that they were drinking from the free government source was full of biological contaminants. We could put it up on a screen, and you would see them leaning forward. And the first feeling was excitement and then kind of shame. They would say, "Are we poisoning our babies?" And then you'd have to say, "No, you're not, but this is why they have diarrhea. And now we're going to test this Water Health International water." Long story, a lot of mistakes. But now this company not only reaches 4 million people with water because of partnership with government, but 5 copycat companies have come up, and there's a new conversation about what it actually takes. But it was long, it was messy, and it required funders that were willing to go to the failures part and not just want to hear the good stories side of what it takes. And that's leadership.
But I think that's very important to talk about the failures of philanthropy. I think that because philanthropy is very scary. You know, it's intimidating, and how do you do it, and how do you do it right? It's a little bit like landscaping. You know, you feel like you should go with a specialist because, and then all of a sudden you plant a tree and you see the tree. So I think it's important. Philanthropy is many things. It's money, it's big money, it's organization, but it's also paying attention to the little detail, paying attention to what people say. You know, philanthropy is also, you don't have to be in need to also need philanthropy. You know, I play a stupid little game with myself every morning that the first email I do doesn't benefit me. And it's a very stupid little thing. And, but where you can introduce, via an email, you can introduce one person to another person, and without even speaking, you can change someone's life. And I think it is when you get involved in philanthropy, and you get involved also at a certain age, it is true what Oprah says. There is, and it sounds a little corny to say it, but there's so much pleasure and so much gift in giving. And when you put yourself in that mood, all of a sudden, everything looks different. And I think that, you know, we make mistakes and you do things, and it all goes with goodwill. But if you pay attention, then, you know, and if so I think it's really about opening your heart and everything along with it.
I think all that philanthropy can do, I mean, when we think about in this room about being a philanthropist, you know, even if you added up all the money in this room and we gave every bit of it away, it still is absolutely a teeny tiny fraction of any of the problems that we're talking about up here. So all philanthropy can do is be the catalytic wedge. It can be the way that looks at the mistakes and figures out how to do things differently. It can be a way of really listening to, okay, maybe we have the right water solution, but women aren't adopting it for a certain reason because we haven't created the exact right solution that they want, or we haven't educated them in a way that they understand, or we haven't picked the right women's leaders. But philanthropy can only be the catalytic wedge. If you want to do something at large scale, you have to think about showing the ways, doing the experiments, taking the risk out of the equation, at least the way Bill and I think about it, and then get governments to scale up what you're going to do. And the risky piece is the piece that governments can't go and do, but they will allow you to come in and do in concert with them. And ultimately, you want the village to adopt it because you've listened to what their needs are, and you want the government to scale it up. And if you think about what the failures of capitalism are, philanthropy is trying to fill in the places that capitalism doesn't really go. As Warren says, it's the easy pitches have already been taken. Philanthropy is taking the really hard pitches. The why is it that a vaccine doesn't reach a child in the developing world? Why is it that clean water isn't reaching a mother in India and her family? Why is it that we're not pulling out these women African leaders and getting them on world stages so they can talk about what's really going on in their country? So if you find the thing that I think is closest to your heart as a person or as a couple, that's where you should invest, and then you should think about how does my money ultimately catalyze change? And what could I do to learn and take some risk out of the equation and ultimately get it scaled up so it ends up serving millions of people? At least that's how Bill and I think about the philanthropy.
And I would just add that there's never been a moment like today for this kind of catalytic philanthropy in finding these solutions, because we're seeing such a convergence in the world. I got back from Kenya last night, and on Saturday, I was visiting a tea plantation, a cooperative, where we've invested in a company that's built a technology platform to essentially allow for greater efficiencies all along the supply chain. I've been working in this part of Kenya for 25 years, so even 10 years ago, you'd go to a tea co-op, it would take you 8 hours to get through the mud. You would show up at the input house, the intake house, and nobody would be there. Maybe a woman would straggle in with her basket of tea. The tea would be weighed manually, and she knew the guy was ripping him off, and he was happy to rip her off. And the whole thing would feel very, very depressing. Well, now, because you've got this confluence of entrepreneurs, better infrastructure, roads, we got there in 2.5 hours. The same woman comes with her 14 kilos of tea leaves to a vibrant intake house. The technology allows her to weigh her own tea. She sees the 14 kilograms. A person in her co-op inputs it all into the PDA, which is sent to the trucking place where all the tea is going to be gathered in a few hours so that they can start planning. Meanwhile, the production manager, who's this extraordinary woman, is making sure that the women also get health care and other training, because they have a platform of 7,000 farmers. And Marks and Spencer does an experiment with this company for the first time to buy tea that's directly packaged by the Kenyans rather than just buying the tea leaf. So they get about 300% more than they were getting. And the European Union insists on fair trade tea, including a gender piece. So many women have to be part of a farming cooperative for them to get the premium on the tea. So suddenly you've got all the different players, because philanthropy enabled this crazy entrepreneur to create a new platform that would allow traceability and transparency, to create a system where government, civil society, the entrepreneurs, and the capital providers could all come together. And I think that's the hope for really smart philanthropy in the next chapter.
You know, I see that this room, there's a lot of men, mostly men. And so I would like to bring the attention that one of the problems that still is very, very, very serious in the world, and in this country included, is violence against women. And if each of you will take just a few minutes to think about that, and you all have a mother, and you know how much you love and respect your mother, and just, you know, I think that these things have to be, people have to be aware of that, and women are, we give life, and we are half of the population of the world, and we don't sit enough on the boards. We are not enough in office. We just don't have enough of a voice. And if each of you can think of that for your companies, and you can make a little change.